Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the event. Welcome to everybody here in person. Welcome to the audience online. Thank you everybody for being here with us today. My name is Jeff Sebo. I, along with Becca Franks, who will be up a little bit later in the session, direct the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program, which is hosting this event alongside our co-sponsors, NYU Animal Studies and the NYU Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy. And just to tell you a little bit about the Wild Animal Welfare Program, we are a research and outreach and field building program housed in the Department of Environmental Studies, and we examine what wild animals are like, how humans and wild animals interact, and how we can improve our interactions with wild animals at scale. And we do that through our own research as well as through events like this one and other activities. So if you have interest in those types of topics, check out our website, sign up for our mailing list. Now, with that said, we are very excited to have Christine here for this event today. So I will introduce her in a moment, but first let me just tell you what you can expect from the next 75 minutes or so. So Christine is going to give a talk about the myth of human exceptionalism and why it matters, and then there will be plenty of time for moderated discussion. Becca will moderate discussion and take questions from the in-person audience and the online audience. So the in-person audience, you can raise your hand as you normally would when the time comes. The online audience, you can, at any point during the talk, enter questions or comments or objections in the Q&A tab on Zoom, and then Becca will select the most upvoted or the most interesting or the first one she sees and weave those into the conversation. So feel free to do that at any point during the talk. Now, with all of that said, it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. My new colleague in environmental studies, Christine Webb, is an assistant professor in New York University's Department of Environmental Studies, where she is part of the animal studies program as well. She is a broadly trained primatologist with expertise in social behavior, culture, cognition, and emotion. Her research also explores how contemporary norms and institutions shape scientific knowledge of animals and the environment, with a critical emphasis on human exceptionalism. Her work has been covered by popular outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, and the BBC. And I can also add that the talk today is going to be based on this brand new book that just came out. Beautiful cover, brilliant book. I highly recommend checking it out. The Arrogant Ape, The Myth of Human Exceptionalism and Why It Matters. So please join me in welcoming Christine.
Hi everybody, thank you so much to all the sponsors for hosting this event and for all of you for being here. It's really nice to be giving this talk in my new academic home. And as some of you already know, the book grew out of a course that I taught at Harvard for a number of years called The Arrogant Ape. And I also got to teach that course at NYU for a semester. And so many of the students' ideas and questions are folded into the book. And so I'm very grateful to them. Some of them have joined us today, I understand. So thanks for being here. And I also wanted to mention another source of great inspiration to me, the very recently late and great Jane Goodall, who made foundational contributions to our understanding of our closest living primate relatives that challenged some of our most cherished assumptions about what sets humans apart. And she was able to do this in part because she went beyond the confines of the dominant scientific approach at the time and broke some taboos, such as using chimpanzee names rather than numbers, and using words like culture to describe their communities. So I just wanted to mention her and to keep her legacy in mind throughout this talk today. As you'll see, it's quite relevant. Her legacy is quite relevant to some of the points that I'll be making. Okay, what makes us human? You can almost hear this question now. It's echoing over time through university halls like these, and through archaeological sites and places of worship, courtrooms, and natural history museums, and zoo exhibits, where many of us first come eye to eye with our closest living primate relatives. As for answers to this age-old question, there have been no shortage. From faculties like reason or rationality, to the capacity to make and use tools and other forms of technology, to develop language, culture, morality, self-awareness, a sense of the future, artistic sensibilities, the list goes on and on. But importantly, each time we've tried to define what it means to be human, other animals have been cast as deficient in or as entirely lacking the trait in question. The political scientist John Rodman's differential imperative is a critique of the Western historical project that defines humanity by setting it in opposition to animals. According to Rodman, the differential imperative works by establishing human and animal not only as distinct categories, but as hierarchically ordered domains. Versions of the differential imperative, from Aristotle's Scala Naturae to its religious expression in the Great Chain of Being, to adaptations in Enlightenment philosophy and beyond, have propagated this notion of a hierarchy that places humans above animals and all other forms of life, typically on the basis of mental faculties like reason or language or consciousness. And yet these and so many other traits long thought to distinguish humans from other species, arguably all of those mentioned earlier, have been observed in other animals. And not just in chimpanzees and other primates, but in taxa as diverse as pigs and insects, fishes, birds, and more. But as skeptics and a number of angry people who have emailed me since the publication of the book are always quick to point out, chimpanzees are not out there building rockets and sending chimpanzees to the moon, nor are they giving talks or writing books about chimpanzee exceptionalism, though I would gladly read that book. Which leads me to say up front that I am not altogether opposed to the idea that humans have qualities that are unique to them and not found anywhere else in the living world. But I would just note that historically, attempts to define some stable or universal human nature have typically either included members of other species or excluded an array of human beings, often those who are already discriminated against and marginalized in some way by our society. But as long as we want to stress a narrative of human uniqueness, then we might as well do the same for all life forms. All species have evolved specialized adaptations to their environments, and this is equally true for physical traits as it is for cognition. So if humans are unique, then every species is unique. But human exceptionalism is different from human uniqueness. Human exceptionalism suggests that what is distinctive about humans is somehow more worthy and advanced than, rather than simply different from, the distinctive features of other forms of life. The underlying argument of my book is that human exceptionalism is at the root of the ecological crisis. This pervasive mindset gives humans a sense of dominion over nature, set apart from and entitled to commodify the earth and other species for their own exclusive use. And I use the phrase "at the root" very deliberately here because I do not think that the ecological crisis can be readily distilled into a single cause. Rather, root systems are complex, and they rarely have a single dominant node. All nodes are interconnected, and they affect and reinforce one another, just like the diverse causes of the environmental crisis. And yet, the ideology of human exceptionalism is rarely named or acknowledged, at least in much of the mainstream climate and environmental discourse. And in this way, it remains invisible, while other causes like fossil fuels and overpopulation and habitat destruction are identified and studied. Much of human exceptionalism's power is drawn from this invisibility. I consider it to be the most powerful unspoken belief of our time. As I also explain in the book, drawing on a growing academic literature on the topic, this ideology of human exceptionalism doesn't just rationalize the exploitation of other species, it also reinforces inequality amongst humans. So historically, women and enslaved people and other marginalized groups have been positioned below the ideal human prototype and often not considered fully human at all. In this way, human exceptionalism has historically denied full humanity to certain groups and subordinated them on the basis of their supposedly animal-like qualities. Some scholars even go so far as to argue that the subjugation of other animals served as the very foundation for the entire edifice of social stratification. Many assume that human exceptionalism is inevitable and universal, and that people everywhere tend to care about and value humans more than non-human life. But recent studies in cross-cultural and developmental psychology are challenging these assumptions. Not all human cultures uphold a hierarchical divide between humans and other species, and I think we have much to learn from these alternative relationships and ideologies. I'm also very delighted, it's been very good timing, that there is a rapidly growing developmental literature on this topic, which looks at whether questions such as whether young children prioritize humans over other species to the same extent as adults do. So in one 2021 study, researchers have presented 5 to 9-year-old American children and adults with moral dilemmas that pitted varying numbers of humans against varying numbers of either dogs or pigs. These hypothetical scenarios depicted 2 sinking ships that contained either human or other animal passengers who could not swim, and participants had to choose one boat to save. And they found that children were considerably less likely than adults to prioritize humans over other animals. So they often opted to save multiple dogs over one human, and many valued the life of a dog as much as the life of a human. Whereas in striking contrast, most adults chose to save one human over even 100 dogs. And although both children and adults valued pigs slightly less, the pattern was overall consistent. These findings suggest that human exceptionalism is not inborn, a bias that's somehow intrinsic to our biological makeup as human beings. But instead, they suggest that the belief that humans are morally special is socially acquired, an aspect of our culture. And the researchers on this study argued that children learn to prioritize humans over other animals only as they gain experience and knowledge of how humans use and exploit animals in our society. So coming back to this idea that human exceptionalism is the most powerful unspoken belief of our time, it's invisible in the dominant culture not necessarily because it's hidden or impossible to find, but because it's rarely explicitly articulated and scrutinized. So I see it as kind of everywhere and nowhere all at once. It's so ingrained that it's normalized that people don't necessarily question it, not necessarily the people in this room. And I've therefore come to think of the arrogant ape not as a species or even a culture, but as a tragic protagonist in a Greek drama, blinded by their own hubris. This unfortunate and dangerous way of viewing our world is a brainwashing of such major proportions that many people remain entirely unaware of it. From a young age, the myth of human exceptionalism gets internalized and reinforced in our society in various ways, in our schools and our textbooks, our sermons, political campaigns, advertising, movies, media, our language, and more. But perhaps most unsettlingly, human exceptionalism has even seeped into our sciences. And since I'm a scientist, and I know there are many scientists in the room here today, and science is a major component of the Wild Animal Welfare Program, this is part of the book I want to dive into with all of you. And today, science is the method that many of us have come to trust and rely on for explaining our place in nature and for explaining nature and other species. But when we let this ideology of human exceptionalism infiltrate science, it leads to biases that perpetuate human exceptionalism rather than a more humble and authentic view of human capabilities. And I think this is one of the major reasons why the myth of human exceptionalism still haunts our thinking today. And I think this is one of the major reasons why, in contrast to Darwin's theory of mental continuity between species, the differential imperative appears to be going strong. So where has human exceptionalism crept into our science? I will not have time today to go through the various ways I explore in my book, but I instead will focus on 3. And I'm going to illustrate how the bias of human exceptionalism affects science with a focus on my own field as a primatologist, but I think and I hope broader lessons can be learned for how we study other animals, plants, and other forms of life. I have to thank Becca for sharing this cartoon many years ago. So first, how does human exceptionalism stack the deck against other species, biasing the development of hypotheses and the design of experiments and the interpretation of evidence in a way that favors human abilities? And in doing so, how does it blind us to the wonderful and even magical qualities that other forms of life possess? So to illustrate, I'm going to play 2 brief videos from a study by a world-famous primatology lab that compared the pro-social cooperative tendencies of human children and chimpanzees. And as you're watching these, just note the differences in the experimental paradigms that are used to study humans versus chimpanzees. So in the case of the children participants, the experimenter pretends to need help on a certain cooperative task, and then they measure whether the child engages in some kind of assistance or support.
Sorry, it's off. I'm not sure why this is happening.
No worries.
I apologize.
For the chimpanzee participants in this exact same study, the experiment went as follows. So as you've hopefully already discerned, there are some very glaring methodological differences here. And I should say that these differences are not necessarily unique to this particular study, but they are generally characteristic of comparative cognition research on the whole, which is the field of study that compares the cognitive abilities of humans and other species, often our closest living primate relatives, side by side. So for one, the human participants are relatively autonomous individuals who come into the lab for the day to participate in the study, and then they return home afterwards, likely to their family. Whereas the chimpanzees in this study are captive individuals living in deprived social and physical environments. While the human children are tested with conspecifics, so they're tested with human experimenters, the chimpanzees are tested with a member of another species. While children remain in the same room as experimenters during the task, chimpanzees are separated by physical barriers from the experimenters. In this case, it's just plexiglass, but in many studies, it will be a mesh barrier or a cage. The human children typically remain in close proximity to a caregiver during the study, while the chimpanzees are separated from the group during testing, not to mention often from their biological mothers from birth. And whereas human children are tested on conspecific tasks and materials, chimpanzees are tested on human tasks and materials. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the study found that children were more cooperative than the chimpanzees. So children successfully participated in cooperative problem-solving activities and social games, whereas the chimpanzees were uninterested in the social games. And all children produced at least one communicative attempt to re-engage the experimenter, whereas no chimpanzee ever made any such communicative attempt. The researchers of the study concluded that they had found evidence for a uniquely human form of cooperation that involves shared intentionality. But in reality, given the methodological discrepancies, the study did not identify species differences, but rather the effect of different physical and social environments. So given the fact that these chimpanzees are highly unrepresentative of chimpanzees on the whole, I should also note that the humans are highly unrepresentative of humanity on the whole. But the chimpanzees are highly unrepresentative of chimpanzees. They live in deprived physical and social environments. How could this pass as a valid scientific comparison? How does this get by? And as the primatologist Christophe Bosch points out, he's also done a lot of work to identify these inconsistencies and biases in comparative cognition research. He writes, the recent acceptance of experimental studies with captive individuals as fully representative of an entire species, with captive individuals considered as fully representative of an entire species, is based on the assumption that socio-ecological factors play a minimal role in the development of the cognitive and cultural abilities of the individual. So a chimpanzee is a chimpanzee, no matter where they're from. And this kind of biological essentialism, which minimizes how animals' cognitive worlds and lives and abilities are shaped by their physical and social environments, stacks the deck against them in human-animal comparisons when it comes to cooperation and many other forms of social and physical cognition. And this is an example of what I call scientific speciesism, which is a type of confirmation bias that leads researchers to interpret data in a way that's consistent with pre-existing anthropocentric beliefs about the world. And I liken scientific speciesism to a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we have this deep-rooted assumption that compared to humans, animals' lives and interests and experiences are not as important or as complex in shaping who they are, which leads us to design studies that disregard their interests and experiences, and then findings from those studies reinforce the idea that humans have these superior cognitive abilities compared to our close primate relatives. Of course, in the wild, the picture looks quite different. Chimpanzees will share food with unrelated group members, and they will work cooperatively towards joint goals during hunting and risky intergroup encounters. So observations in natural environments suggest that the human chimpanzee differences in cooperation and other forms of social cognition are not as stark as usually proposed. And yet there's a sizable bias in how knowledge derived from research in either captive or natural environments is represented in the primate literature. So a 2019 study surveyed the major review and theory papers on primate cognition. They found that the laboratory studies get cited far more in the literature. And in those lab studies, the vast majority implemented experimental rather than observational methods. So if we're getting the science this wrong for our closest living primate relatives, not only whose interior, subjective worlds, cognitive and emotional lives we more readily appreciate and accept, but also who have similar body plans and life histories and perceptual abilities. If we're getting it this wrong for our closest living primate relatives, how wrong must we be getting it for other animals who are so much less like us and who experience and engage with the world in radically diverse ways? So this brings me to the next way in which human exceptionalism creeps into science, which is when we use human or primate-centric standards as the benchmark for intelligence or consciousness or other cognitive abilities. So this is one of my favorite cartoons to teach with, where you see 7 animals lined up before a human instructor who states, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And of course, the same standards of assessment aren't appropriate across species because each species fulfills a different cognitive niche. But too often we overlook this. And one of the best illustrations of this bias comes from research on self-awareness. Though it is a controversial method for a number of reasons, which I'm happy to get into later, the standard method for measuring self-awareness in other animals is called the mirror self-recognition task. And in the mirror self-recognition task, an experimenter will surreptitiously place a mark on a subject's body. And then they'll present that participant with a mirror and observe how the participant responds to their own mirror image. And if the participant attends very carefully to the mark or perhaps tries to remove the mark, it's said that they have passed the mirror self-recognition task, that they recognize that the individual they see in the mirror is a reflection of them. And humans and other primates and a handful of other species will pass the mirror self-recognition task. And notoriously, dogs have failed. And for people who live with dogs, for people who know dogs, study dogs, I think also dogs occupy this like privileged position along with non-human primates where, you know, we really readily acknowledge their emotional lives and cognitive abilities compared to those of other species. And yet dogs were continuously failing this task. So it had people who work with dogs, live with dogs, study dogs, had those people quite confused, right? Is this really an indication that dogs are not self-aware? Well, for one, the mirror mark test favors visually dominant species like humans and other primates. So what about dogs and wolves, who primarily navigate the world through their sense of smell? So more recent studies have used a novel design that was extrapolated from the natural behavior of canids. And experimenters presented dogs with various canisters. Each of these canisters contained an odor. And in the key test, they presented dogs either with an olfactory mirror, so basically the dog's own urine, or a canister in which that odor, their urine, had an added substance to it, so that scent was slightly modified. And researchers found that dogs, and in the case of this study that I have pictured here, wolves could easily distinguish between the olfactory image of themselves versus others. In other words, they exhibited self-awareness, so the dogs would attend way more to the can that contained the modified odor. And the wolves engaged in this scent marking behavior. So the meaning of this behavior is slightly unclear, but scent rolling is thought to be a way to collect other animals' smells, to either camouflage themselves from predation or to inform other group members of the surrounding elements. And so when given a task that was suited to their perceptual worlds, they were able to succeed. Just sharing a relevant line from a poem by Mary Oliver here. A dog can never tell you what she knows from the smells of the world, but you know watching her that you know almost nothing. But again, the literature reflects a human-centric bias. So researchers have conducted a review of the dog cognition literature, and of the hundreds of studies reviewed, the vast majority tested dogs on visual task paradigms, whereas only a small fraction used olfactory cues. And even though the number of dog publications has increased considerably in recent years, the proportion of articles that mention olfactory cues and controls remained consistently low, as did the proportion of articles investigating olfaction. So my point here is that by taking a human-centric view, you can only tell us how other species perform on tasks in which humans and perhaps other primates excel. It's going to tell us very little about other species' own evolved cognitive adaptations. It would be a little bit like blindfolding humans and testing their intelligence through their sense of smell, or presenting them with sticks, rocks, and nuts of varying sizes, and measuring their intelligence by comparing their performance on nut cracking tasks with the performance of chimpanzees. These tasks involve things like causal reasoning and foresight and manual dexterity and sustained attention. So would we conclude that humans are inferior in these cognitive abilities compared to chimpanzees based on their performance on a task that is way more relevant to chimpanzees? And that's why I like this satirical online publication from The Onion, which sums up this anthropocentric bias rather well. So when you measure the world with a ruler that's made for humans, other species inevitably will come up short. And this brings me to my third and final way that I'll talk about today, at least, in which human exceptionalism has seeped into the sciences. There's no single linear narrative of evolutionary progress. Instead, evolution is a process of continuous branching outwards and diversification. It's far more like a tree, or perhaps even better, a web, than it is a ladder of life. The evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould vehemently cautioned against equating evolutionary change with directionality and progress. And yet the process is often interpreted or presented as progressive, or what Gould called orthogenic, culminating in us. Classic depictions of these major evolutionary transitions will show microbes and plants and invertebrates leading up to smaller vertebrates like fish and birds, and finally large mammals like us at the top. These renderings reinforce the widely held but erroneous view that evolution somehow proceeds from primitive to more advanced organisms. Darwin himself maintained that it's absurd to talk about one animal being higher than another. Yet talk of higher and lower organisms is still common today, and this is another area in which science is not immune. So one 2013 study documented higher and lower language in the top 16 scientific journals and found that the use of such language is still surprisingly prevalent. We have a tendency to assume that our species is the end point of evolution, that there is some inexorable trend toward humanness. This iconic image shows the silhouettes of humans' ancestors gradually transitioning from hunched-over ape-like forms to upright cavemen-looking figures that eventuate in Homo sapiens. Now, people often will misinterpret this image as evidence of a linear process through which modern humans descended from chimpanzees. But humans did not evolve from monkeys or apes. We share a common ancestor with both chimpanzees and bonobos, who lived somewhere around 5 to 7 million years ago. Chimpanzees and bonobos and all other species with whom we share ancestry and who are still alive today, who have not yet gone extinct, have continued to evolve in parallel as this evolutionary tree continues to branch outward. And yet linear representations like these tend to erase those other than human histories, and they elide the diversification of species into one human-centric story. So to make this point even more clear, consider the following question in relation to the evolutionary tree pictured here. Are frogs more closely related to fish or to humans? Many people will intuitively interpret this image here, this tree, as indicating a closer relatedness between frogs and fish than between frogs and humans. But because frogs and humans share a more recent common ancestor, one that is not shared with fishes, frogs are more closely related to humans than to fishes. This image here on your right is equally valid from a taxonomic standpoint, but it makes the closer evolutionary link between frogs and humans more obvious. But these kinds of presentations are far less typical than the version on your left, which can be readily misread as an evolutionary trend toward humanness from left to right. So there's a great fallacy in making humans the reference point for the rest of the biological world, not only because of the ways in which it limits the science and distorts the science, but also, as I write about more in depth in the book, because it deprives us of a richer and fuller perspective and way of life. So to conclude, what does it mean to be human? The eco-philosopher David Abram suggests that our first hint to this question might come from the word human itself, which derives from the root word humus, which means earth. So to be human means to be of the earth, not apart from or better than any of the other species with whom we share this planet. And so why do we keep insisting otherwise? And is there an alternative approach to this age-old defense mechanism? According to Abram, the answer lies in another word that shares the same ancestry: humility, the state of being close to the earth. Humility today remains one of the most understudied virtues in all of psychology, but we know that it helps shape our relationships. It helps us better understand the people around us and form stronger, healthier relationships with them. So what if we extended that logic and that humbler approach towards how we relate to the rest of the living world and to the science that seeks to understand it? What if we saw all species as special and wise in their own right? Hardly a day goes by when I don't see human exceptionalism perpetuated somehow in the news or in academic articles. Whether it's microscopic viruses or entire forest systems, this worldview is everywhere at the root of our problematic relationship with the rest of nature. And to better this relationship, I think we first need to recognize this worldview for what it is and free ourselves from its limitations. As we've seen, adopting a humbler approach towards other species will affect the way that we study them, and what we find may only reinforce that humbler perspective, letting other species show us who they really are. Shedding an anthropocentric lens can yield more humbling realizations, and I think this humility could impart true wisdom, the quality our species, Homo sapiens, has assigned itself, but only through unlearning human exceptionalism will we ever truly realize. Thanks so much, and I welcome your questions. Thanks. Okay.
Is that a problem?
Yeah, there was a free, Jeff had like a free, yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
All right, so while we're just getting set up here. Yeah. Great. Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry about that. And this is a good for viewing. Okay. Thank you so much for that outstanding talk. I really, I think there's so many layers and there's so much depth to excavate, and this is something that you and I have talked about a lot over the years, and I think it speaks to the profundity of the issue that I still learn so much new stuff every time I hear you speak about it. So I'm just so grateful for you giving this talk and for us having this opportunity to have a discussion together here. So we have some questions from our online audience, which is a very large and active online audience. So I just want to shout that out because sometimes it can be hard to tell when you're in the webinar, but we have 94 participants online. And then we have a lovely in-person audience here with us as well. So if there are eager questions from our in-person audience, we'll start here, and then I'll move to one from the online audience. Yes, please. And
sorry, microphone.
Is there a floater microphone? Yeah, okay. The microphone's coming.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Talking about humility at this point in history is really important. So I wonder if you can comment on the role of gender in, I don't know, promoting exceptionalism, or conversely, humility as something that's important in science, let's say, or intellectual life in general.
Yeah, there's many different ways I could go with answers to that. I am thinking, though, in particular of a study that was done in science classrooms, kind of an ethnography of dissection modules and how students responded to the requirement of this activity. And so sociologists went into the classroom and observed very carefully students' reactions during the dissections, and there was absolutely a gendered component where the younger girls, and those were middle school students, I believe, were far more uncomfortable and concerned about where this specimen had come from, and resistant to actually doing the activity than the boys in the same classroom. And we could liken this to different forms of socialization, right, where the girls feel, or the boys feel less comfortable expressing their own discomfort, and the girls are sort of less easily desensitized to it all. But there could also be a biological component there too, right? So it's certainly a combination of both, and that's just one example of many, I think, gender differences and that relate to human exceptionalism.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, great. We'll take one more. One more from the audience here.
Thank you so much. This was awesome. Congrats on the book. Welcome to NYU. The experiment you were talking about, the 2 experiments in comparative cognition, where you're talking about stacking the deck, it just seems so outrageous that these experiments are being done that way. And I'm not a scientist, so I'm just trying to understand, how is such terrible science happening? Who is funding these experiments? Is there some nefarious element here that helps us to understand how people who are thinking that they're conducting a responsible experiment are failing to see factors that are so glaringly important, even if you're just looking at the 2 photographs of the experiments before you even hear about them?
Or even if you don't have photo evidence, if you just know that chimps are in captive environments.
So what is the context for this kind of research that could help us to understand how these sociocultural factors are just being completely ignored?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think the broader context relates to something that we've talked about a lot, which is this emphasis on laboratory studies because of your ability to control various aspects of the environment. And somehow by having more control over all of the possible variables that could be influencing your study, you are doing more rigorous work. And so as someone who reviews, is asked to be a reviewer for papers on wild chimpanzee behavior and captive chimpanzee behavior, there's often discussion amongst reviewers and authors about the trade-offs of these different forms of knowledge and what is possible in these different environments. And I think when I or others have critiqued these glaring methodological differences, particularly when the conclusions are making claims about samples that are far more general, right, than the samples that they are studying, but they're drawing conclusions about chimpanzees and humans in general. so when you criticize those methods, often the sort of feedback that you get is like, well, this is the best that we can do with a bad situation, right? It's how else are we going to be able to control all of these different things? How else are we going to be able to observe these things so up close and personal? It is harder to observe things in the wild, for sure, right? The animals are free to go where they want. If you're wanting to study cooperation or you're wanting to give them some kind of task, there's all sorts of ethical and other reasons why, you know, people question that. And I think it's just, I don't know if you want to add something, but it's like these sort of supposed trade-offs in the different approaches and this assumption that somehow, you know, by putting them in these physically deprived and socially deprived environments, we're gaining something which would be more visibility and more control.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. And I think one of the things that we could also discuss here that you've written about in your book, too, is another form of human exceptionalism, of course, is to imagine that humans have psychology and no other animals do, and that to speak of the subjective feelings or the internal states or the motivations or preferences, desires, fears of non-human animals is considered to be unscientific, period. Whereas it's not considered to be unscientific to do that in human spaces. So like an entire field of psychology is essentially devoted to a single species, humans. Yeah. And so there's like this other form of human exceptionalism that erases the subjectivity that would sort of be the source of the problem. You know, the emotional response that you would have of being in a cage and being tested by, you know, a stranger who's of a different species is like not on the radar. It's not scientific to even say what I just said, right?
Yeah.
So I think that creates another blind spot and something that you talk about as well in the book.
Yeah, and also just, I mean, it's not this bias, this massive blind spot. It's not particular to comparative cognition, but when you look at, you know, all of biomedical research, right, which is based on the assumption that the individuals living in these cages should be healthy biological and psychological beings, right? But they're not, clearly, because they're living in cages that represent like an infinitesimal proportion of their home range. But it's still, because of the sort of normalization of it all, and because of this notion that animals lack these interior lives that would be shaped and affected by those deprived environments, and because of this illusion of like more control over the data, those trade-offs get overlooked. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We'll come back to the in-person audience, but I'm going to jump to a question from the online audience. So we talked a little bit about maybe some, you know, are there gender, sex differences in human exceptionalism? But also, if you could speak a little bit about like the history of human exceptionalism, like when did this become prominent? When did we start becoming obsessed about this, or you know, the extent to which the dominant culture is, and how does that contrast to other worldviews that emphasize a deep connection with nature?
Yeah. So scholars have often traced human exceptionalism back to Greek and Hellenistic philosophy, particularly Aristotle's Scala Naturae, which I presented a picture of earlier. Some actually go back even further to the agricultural revolution, when humans started to control, coerce, manipulate nature in a particular way, sort of cordon themselves off from nature, settled in, you know, urban centers, stopped being as nomadic. I'm always a little hesitant to go back that far, just because, I mean, I think there are so many different ways of farming and doing agriculture that it doesn't necessarily all then lead to a relationship of hierarchy and domination. But the sociologist Eileen Christ, you know, she writes about how the agricultural revolution likely preconditioned the human mind favorably towards the differential imperative, so that when Aristotle's Scala Naturae became, you know, publicly known, that the mind was sort of already preconditioned, was primed to accept this more hierarchical view of life. And then the Scala Naturae, which, placed humans at the top, followed by those animals that resembled us, all the way down, to animals who don't resemble us, like reptiles and who we call fishes, and insects down to plants, and then even further on the ladder, inorganic matter, rocks. That sort of biological representation was then adopted in Christian thought through the great chain of being, which instead of placing humans at the top, actually placed like gods and spirits and angels at the top, and followed by humans who were able to kind of uniquely straddle the immaterial world of God and the soul with the material animal world of the body sort of ranking below them. And yeah, these ideas are pervade, Enlightenment philosophy, and as I was showing today, are not totally absent from our scientific representations of nature and the way that we talk about and understand especially the mental lives of other species. So that's like a very brief history of the idea, but there's a lot more in the book, a lot more detail.
That's great. Okay. And
yeah.
Sorry, I just want to make sure that the audio comes through for everyone. So related to that, another question from the online audience from Lori Marino is curious about what you think about Ernst Becker's view that human exceptionalism is based on mortality anxiety.
Oh. Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar with, I think, this general notion, which is that humans have this fear of death. It's in this broader theory we're talking about. It's called terror management theory, that really pervades aspects of their everyday life and way of being in the world. And part of that, fear of death is that death reminds us of our own animality and our own animal bodies. And I do think that there have actually been I think a number of really interesting studies on this, where they prime participants to think more about death, and then will present them with images or scenarios, and those who have been primed to think about death are more likely to rank humans as high, as more morally important than other forms of life. So I do think that there's a certain vulnerability in death that reminds us of our animal biological natures that we are quite resistant to. So I think, yeah, the ideas are very, very in sync with one another.
Intertwined.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And let's take one from the audience here. I think I saw a couple hands. I had seen your hand first, and then we'll go to the back.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I wonder if, I don't know, what do you think about this, our context in this moment, are arising artificial intelligence, and do you think that this fact has shaken this unique and this exceptionalism? That's my.
What was the last part of your question? Just I want to make sure I understood the last few words you said.
Okay. If I don't know if what do you think about the fact that in this moment, with the rising of the artificial intelligence in this moment, has I don't know, put in danger, I don't know, shaking this idea of our exceptionalism.
Okay. Yeah. Great question. I don't get into AI at all in the book because it felt like such a massive undertaking and question, and I would absolutely direct you to Jeff Seafo's book, The Moral Circle, which deals with it in detail, and there's also a book by James Bridle called Ways of Being. Both of these books really take that topic head on. And yeah, I mean, I think the thing about AI is that it's human-made, right? And so I think we more readily acknowledge or are perhaps more comfortable talking about learning and intelligence in these AI systems than we are sometimes with the living world, which I think is quite interesting and perhaps more a reflection of human exceptionalism, because we made these things, right? That we are less hesitant to talk about how intelligent they are. And I mean, there's even, questions about AI sentience and consciousness, and we're far from resolving those debates in the living world. And I think, another piece of it is just that, these models are able to outperform, these technologies are able to outperform humans on a number of different tasks, and certainly one could imagine that could humble us a bit and put us in our place. But again, it sort of depends on what your starting conditions or starting points are, because some people use that same logic to say, well, humans are capable, whatever we're not capable of, we just build technologies to make up for our weaknesses and what we lose. I will take this opportunity to also add that there's really interesting studies right now on how anthropocentric bias actually gets built into AI. So in like large language models like ChatGPT, a lot of anthropocentric assumptions are already baked into that, and even the sort of language that is used, the imagery that is produced, have kind of a way of reinforcing and perpetuating human exceptionalism. And I think we need to, and among other biases, and I think we need to really be attending carefully to that.
Thank you. We'll go to the back there.
Thank you again for the talk. I was wondering, I'm sorry, I'm just reading this so I don't get the question wrong. I was wondering if there's examples of researchers who have come to realize their assumption of human exceptionalism had compromised their work and had changed course. And then also, are there examples of, I guess, for lack of a better term, maybe scholarly allies who are kind of engaged in holding accountable people who have not yet realized this and are kind of leading the reappraisal that you're doing in your book?
Great question. I mean, I would say probably both of us. Yeah, two of us here. And no, so many researchers, I think, have moved, past this human exceptionalism framework. Jane Goodall is one that I mentioned earlier. Franz Sewall, my mentor. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, an indigenous botanist. Monica Gagliano, a colleague of ours. There's endless amount of scientists who are, Barbara Smuts, who formed, relationships that were based on mutual trust and empathy with the baboons she studied, approached them as individuals. There's a ton of examples of science that is done in a more humble way and that is really trying to challenge, the anthropocentric bias in science, not just for ethical reasons, but also for scientific reasons. I think, the concern that we have and we talk about often is how, for some of us, that change occurred at a point in our careers where we had options and where we had choices and where we could find other colleagues who were maybe breaking some taboos or doing things in an unconventional way and challenging the existing paradigm. And, that is a privilege for a number of reasons. And so, how can we make sure that students who are sort of entrenched within the governing scientific paradigm have those outlets and opportunities and have actually permission to maybe do things a little differently and question and challenge, the systems of which they are a part, because I think, it takes a certain level of privilege and freedom and experience it within, those systems and outside of them, reaching other people to be empowered to question them.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in here with two points to follow. I think having those colleagues and, being able to construct networks where you can actually have conversations without feeling shut down from the get-go, just to explore ideas, is absolutely crucial. And one of the things that we're so proud of with our department in environmental studies and animal studies, that we're creating those sorts of spaces where we can make real advancements in terms of making progress without having to sort of be overly concerned about just a baseline interest in what animals are capable of and what we can learn from them. So I think it couldn't be more valuable to have those sorts of networks, and we hope to see that sort of spread and gain power going forward. And then just because I study fish and I can't help but, slip some fish facts in. I had always wanted to study fish, but I had, wanted to study them in this way and felt like it would be impossible to study fish. So I was working with monkeys and rats. But then I finally started working with fish, and I had this experience that you had just identified of, basically having human exceptionalism built into the way that I was thinking about studying these animals, and always having the animals show me that I was wrong, that I was underestimating them. And so when I switched to studying fish, I studied zebrafish. They're very small fish. I said, I'm not going to make that mistake again. I'm going to think the world of them, and I can always ratchet down my expectations. And they still exceeded what I was expecting from them in terms of their, sensitivities and their personalities and their social dynamics and their complexities and, the full depth of their lives. And so I think, as Christine has so eloquently shown us, that this is a very, what do you call it? You call it hidden in plain sight.
Yeah.
And because it's hidden in plain sight, it's very hard to even know when you're participating in it, even when you're actively trying to not participate in it. So it's just kind of an ongoing, journey and an unlearning that having colleagues is absolutely crucial for, and support and institutional support too, that we're super grateful for.
Can I add one quick thing?
Yeah.
I'll just say that a small version of what Becca was describing while I was writing the book, I am a primatologist, and I use this word primate countless times every day. Primate, primate, primate. And then I learned that the etymology of primate comes from primata, which means of the first rank. It's a word that I use on countless occasions, and I had never once sort of considered how this ladder thinking, this hierarchical view of life is baked into a word that I use, many times a day. So that was 2 years ago that I learned that in my career as a primatologist.
Wonderful. Okay, let's see. On that note, actually, Jaden Warner on the online audience asks what you think about human exceptionalism as it applies beyond animals to organisms such as plants and microorganisms, or even how humans tend to consider the non-living world. How can resistance to human exceptionalism be related to concepts such as animism, object-oriented ontology, panpsychism, et cetera?
Love that question. I think it absolutely would be a further articulation of human exceptionalism and anthropocentrism if we only applied these arguments to other animals or to those animals who most resembled us. So I'm really interested in how these arguments and this bias really of human exceptionalism also shapes our understanding of plants and microbes and the rest of the animate world. And I think of primates as being this kind of gateway species, where once you start to question certain things in other primates, then you maybe start to question things in other animals more generally, and then it's which animals, and eventually maybe you get to insects. I want to write a paper, Jeff, I haven't even told you, called even in insects, right? Because everybody always talks about we've recognized this capability in primates, birds, dogs, and even insects. It's what does that mean, And then, what about plants and animals? And I think plants and microbes. And I think, one of the clearest ways that we can overcome this bias of human exceptionalism with respect to non-animals is by overcoming a related bias sometimes called neuroexceptionalism, which is the idea that you have to have a brain or a complex nervous system in order to be intelligent or maybe even conscious. And we know from evolution that different structures evolve to serve similar functions. This happens all the time, right? That some, think about lungs, right? Or the function of exchanging gases with the environment. Well, humans have figured that out with lungs, but many fishes, not to mention like all plants, have figured that out another way, right? They don't have lungs, but they can still breathe. And, you know, some animals don't have a visual cortex like humans have, but they still manage to see. And so really just trying to like untie this the sort of biological function from a particular anatomical structure, I think is really, really important for thinking about how we can sort of undo human exceptionalism in animals who don't, you know, have brains or have simple nervous systems. And then to the broader question of, you know, how these topics relate to animism or, you know, panpsychism. I think I do write about this a little bit in the book. You know, I'll focus on panpsychism because animism is sometimes like viewed as a pejorative label, and I don't think that the person means it that way. But panpsychism, you know, being this sense that this idea that consciousness, mindedness is like a ubiquitous aspect of the physical world. You know, I find it appealing for a number of reasons. One of which is that it kind of helps us move away from this tendency to continue moving the bar or the line for mindedness or consciousness lower and lower down the scala naturae, right? It sort of opens up this other area of inquiry that's like, what if we just stop drawing these lines altogether? So, yeah, that's my 2 cents there.
Wonderful, thank you. I saw Tyler. We've got a question in the back, and then we'll come to Tyler.
Thanks so much for this talk. 2 questions that might be the same, just 2 sides of the same coin. A lot of your arguments point to, rightly so, like context specific. Why are we asking different animals to perform the same task when they have different skill sets? Mm-hmm. What would you point to for someone who might suggest that humans are exceptional and that they can change their environments so that they don't have to climb the tree at all, right? Or that they have some other kind of capacity. The other potentially similar question is, I often think of human exceptionalism in the inferior sense, in the sense that, are we the only ones who have to make ourselves humble, like to humble ourselves in order to find this balance with nature? You know, how would you, if you could comment on that at all as well?
Yeah, sure. So with respect to your first question, I feel like this always would come up in my classroom with students where they're like, well, yeah, birds can fly, but we've invented airplanes and rockets, right? So like we develop technologies to make up for what we lack, or we manipulate the environment in such a way so that we can, you know, outperform other species on these tasks in which they naturally excel. And I would just say to that, you know, there are trade-offs to our technological developments, right? And they're not foolproof. And you know, in the case of aviation, right, like the Wright brothers, they developed airplanes by watching gannets, these giant seabirds, like really, really carefully learn to fly. So it wasn't as if those innovations were some great feat of human ingenuity alone, right? It was a form of biomimicry. Like we were actually drawing upon the intelligence of other forms of life. And one of my students once was like, well, that's plagiarism if we're not giving it credit. And I was like, I like that. I like that point. So yeah, I would say, yes, I would agree that we can develop technologies to make up for what we lack, but that there are trade-offs there too. Yeah.
Earthworms?
Yeah, please.
And sorry to jump in, but I just have my favorite example in this regard is actually earthworms. So earthworms are, you know, they are an aquatic species that they evolved from aquatic ecosystems, and they dry out right away, right? Like we all know this, if an earthworm is like out of the ground, it just shrivels up immediately. And so they need to have a moist soil to survive. And when the earthworms that live in North America now are actually an invasive species from Europe. And when they first got here, the soil was very, very dry, but the burrows that they dig increase the soil moisture holding capabilities so that they actually create the environment that they need so that they don't actually evolve to be like tolerant of dry conditions, because they've actually maintained an aquatic condition for themselves and then have changed the entire landscape of North America, and the vegetation and the ecological communities have radically shifted because of the earthworms having that kind of agency and influence on an ecosystem. So I think there's a sense in which we're looking for a certain kind of change that is like to count as like shaping our environment. But it's just another way that like we're doing it. Another great example is bird nests, had not been recognized as like a built environment or tool use until quite recently, but obviously it is, so.
Yeah, no, those are great examples also. And then I'm sorry, I don't think I fully understood your second question, if you wouldn't mind reiterating it.
Sure. So human exceptionalism usually refers up at the top. I often think of imagining ourselves and putting ourselves at the bottom, right? Like, why is it only us as animals that have to remind ourselves to not cause climate change, right? Like, what is it about?
Like, are we yeah, are we exceptionally bad? Oh, yeah. You're reminding me of a bumper sticker I once saw that read, "Flip the Scala Naturae." And I was like, I want that bumper sticker. But I would say, just again, to sort of reiterate that I don't think that this is a human universal, right? That I don't think when we're talking about human exceptionalism, we're talking about all humans, we're talking about a particular, not even a particular culture, right? Perhaps like one could say Western industrialized cultures, but even within the Western tradition, there's been so many countercultures, and even within an individual, across an individual's lifetime, their tendency to endorse human exceptionalism or, right, believe in and be aware of human exceptionalism can change drastically. So again, I really think of it not as a species trait, but more as like a character trait. And yeah, then to this question, like, are we uniquely, is what makes us unique that like we have to sort of humble ourselves? I'm so hesitant to like strip other animals of anything, right? That because of this history where we've just sort of continued to move the goalposts, and all of the different characteristics, these cognitive Rubicons or things that we thought separated humans from other forms of life, proved to not be true. And I say that's true for good and bad characteristics. Like it's not, that humans are not necessarily like the only jerks out there. That many other forms of life can also behave in ways that maybe we would deem not great for the environment, not great for each other. Yeah.
And we're going to take one final quick question in the front here.
You have it first.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I've been reading your book. It's great. And one thing you touch on is that the latter doesn't really end at animals, that misogyny and racism also play into this, the way we think about human exceptionalism.
Yeah.
And that some of the anti-DEI stuff right now is an example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been so much great work in this area about the links between different forms of discrimination and dehumanization. I'll just point to one, which is broadly talked about as like the interspecies model of prejudice, where they do studies, where participants can learn either about human-animal similarities or differences, or they learn about evolutionary continuity or divergences, and then are asked to rank different human groups, or whether they would extend moral consideration to certain human outgroups, and both in terms of like, so these are establishing causation, right? They're not just correlational studies, which have also shown a relationship between bigoted attitudes and beliefs that humans are fundamentally different from other animals. But in these causational in these studies that are establishing causation, those participants who are exposed more to, let's say, newspaper articles that emphasize human-animal similarity are more likely to extend moral consideration to other human outgroups, such as like immigrants, right? So there's absolutely, and that interspecies model of prejudice has been replicated, that general finding has been replicated in young children as well. So there's so many links, and it's really important that we try to keep them all in mind simultaneously when talking about human exceptionalism.
Okay. All right, well, thank you so much. And thank you to our in-person, so let's give Christine another round of applause for your phenomenal book and all of this incredible, deep thinking that has gone into producing it. Thank you to our in-person audience and our wonderful online audience and all of your questions. We really appreciate it. And I want to give a huge shout out to Sophia Davis-Fogel and Audrey Becker, who set up the event for us and are making everything go smoothly and making it seem easy, and all Jeff and I have to do is show up. So thank you so much to you both, and yeah, thanks everyone.